This past week, the consequences of a black man being held in a chokehold for 8 minutes and 46 seconds in the USA took an unexpected turn here in the UK when a group of protesters in Bristol, marching in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, decided to remove a statue of a benefactor to the city because his wealth had been amassed through his involvement in the slave trade. A further consequence of recognising the sins of the past have been the removing from streaming platforms of TV shows and films accused of containing racism, and a slew of apologies from entertainers and comedians for having used blackface or creating racial slurs. All of this happening while the global pandemic continues, with the dire predictions for the economy and employment being set against the goal of the lockdown to prevent deaths. A strategy that has been so successful that the government is now struggling with how to get our society back to work, school, church, and normality. Sin and death. While we have identified a vein of sin committed by some in the past, have we mined all sins from everyone's past? And what about the sins being committed now in the present? And what of those sins that will inevitably be committed by everyone in the future? And when we speak of preventing deaths, what we really mean is that we have postponed death. For all the lives that the NHS has courageously and sacrificially sought to save are nevertheless still destined to die. The whole human race has and will remain on a trajectory from life to death. Sin and death. These are the words we most closely associate with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Words that Paul, in writing his famous epistle to the church in Rome, said the gospel dealt with in a universal and remedial way. Namely, that God in Jesus had freed humanity and creation as a whole from the power and consequences of sin and death. How was it achieved? We begin by looking at the emotions and feelings raised by the events we've been watching on our TV screens over the past few weeks. When George Floyd was slowly suffocated by the policeman leaning on his neck with his knee, there was an immediate recognition that this was wrong, coupled with the outrage that such behaviour might go unpunished. This is called wrath, something which is necessary to ensure that evil is recognised and unmasked. It is what good people feel when they witness wrongdoing and sense a lack of justice. But wrath is also what the upholders of law and order feel when they see people take the law into their own hands and vandalise property, looting shops, or tearing down a statue. Wrath is what leads President Donald Trump or Prime Minister Boris Johnson to declare that such people will face the full force of the law. Such wrath, however, is not based on a deep-based instinct, but on the fact that legal conventions have been breached, man-made laws that can be arbitrary, open to being changed or repealed as well as obeyed. So let's look again at the statue in Bristol, and let's think about what the end result was intended to be. They wanted to remove a statue from its plinth and have it recognised that being there in the 21st century UK was an affront to the black members of the city. How did they intend to get to the end result? A group of citizens, in their righteous wrath, decided to tear it down and throw it into the harbour. But this behaviour caused legal wrath to be exhibited by the lawmakers against those same people because they took the law into their own hands, that made them guilty of vandalism and mob rule. Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, on a radio talk show said in response to this act that it should have been handled by consent. The authorities should have listened to the rightful complaints of the people and then taken steps themselves to make arrangements for the statue to be removed and placed in a museum. And from there, its place in the city's history and why it was no longer standing in the city could be displayed, and the present and future generations educated about its past and the changing and improving ways all sections of society were being upheld in the dignity of their humanity. What we see in this second scenario is that the onus for achieving the goal has moved from the protesters onto the civic leaders. Our Old Testament reading contains the essence of the covenant that God was about to make with the former slave nation of Egypt. God declares the purpose of bringing them out of Egypt. You shall be my treasured possession. You shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. But there is a condition, for the covenant has two parties. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant. But therein lay the problem. For as the history of Israel, from the golden calf right through to the exile demonstrated, the people singularly failed to obey God's voice. The nation was always drawn to idolatry and to the rejection of their God. They were incapable of being a priestly kingdom. The people singularly failed to keep the covenant. They were both morally guilty of breaking God's commandments and of defying God's prophets, and are therefore of being unable to live as a holy nation. Now, to paraphrase the words of Jesus, if you who are evil know how to exhibit wrath, then how much more does the righteous and good God? And so Paul, writing at the very beginning of his letter to the Romans, says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of those who by their wickedness suppress the truth." This wrath of God is that deep-based instinct, rather than the kind based on legal infringements of arbitrary laws. For God not to express his wrath would be like us walking past George Floyd under that knee and seeing nothing wrong and so doing nothing about it. That in itself would be an act of evil. But God is righteous and good, and so God acts. But in this action, God did, as we stated about the problem of the statue, God changed the onus of responsibility for the failure of the covenant away from the people and on to God. God, in doing so, creates a new version of the covenant. And God did so by absorbing, annulling, and abolishing the consequences of human sin. He did so in the death of Jesus on the cross. And by raising Jesus from the dead, started a new creation, where the law of God is not carved in stone, but on human hearts. God changed death from a consequence of sin into a gateway to this new creation. God fully dissipated the wrath so that now what is visited upon his people is experienced as forgiveness and love. Using the courtroom metaphor, God has declared over guilty humanity, "Case dismissed. You are free to go." When we are told this story, this gospel story, we are asked to believe it to be true and to accept its truth and live by its truth. This is what we call our faith, all of which is what led Paul begin our reading from Romans with these words: "Therefore, since we have been put right with God by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand." There has been an element within Christianity that would see the gospel story in purely individualistic terms. This is what God did to save me. But while that is an essential aspect, it is not the whole story. God so loved the world, not just me and you. And we see this concern not just for one or two particular people, but for all people in the gospel. When Jesus looks out at the crowds and sees them as sheep without a shepherd. He sees them harassed and harried by life. He sees the systems that can become corrupt and inflict evil on the innocent. He sees the demands of state that can weigh heavily on the poor and disadvantaged. He sees the sick and diseased who struggle to be healthy and useful. He sees the anxious and afraid who fear the future and approaching death. He sees the disenfranchised and marginalised who are seeking support and acceptance. He sees those treated as scapegoats and are ostracised from society. With God's eyes and God's compassion, he sees all of humanity and knows that there is a way to hope, to new life, through faith, through dying and rising again. Today, we are seeing both crowds on the streets crying out for equality and justice, and we can imagine the huddled masses in their homes, harried and afraid by the virus and its consequences. But often, at this point, the media begins to send us down pathways where the real issues get lost by lesser distracting stories. The more insightful commentators at this point tell us not to lose sight of the real problems, the root of the problems. Sin and death. These remain the root of the problems that afflict humanity in every generation. Sin and death are the source of every human evil and human failing. Every generation has to have the good news of the solution out of our most existential dilemma announced to them. But as Jesus said, and still says, the harvest is plentiful, but the labourers are few.